welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and this is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literature, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. Today, I'm going to cover the early oral stories and culture of the Native peoples of Canada that are generally referred to as the First Nations. Specifically, we're going to be referring to their early history and the way in which the transmission and reception of their oral traditions evolved with European contact. This episode will be quite similar to last week's in its format, but not necessarily in its content, of course. So think of it more of a part 2 from last episodes. Contrary to the Inuit, European contact with the First Nations was much faster and had a much more immediate impact on all spheres of their society. The stories that were told by the various peoples of the First Nations were also different from the Inuit, and their relation to writing and their adopting of those practices came about in a different way. So the content will be a bit different, even if the timeline follows a similar trajectory. Before we get started, I want to plug a project that I think might interest some of my listeners. I've done it before and I'm doing it again. I wrote an essay for Panel by Panel, which is a fantastic comics criticism magazine. It's called Giants in the Shadows and is about Canadian comics and what they tell us about the time they were published in. So it's a bit like this show, but in text format. You can order it now in print through Kickstarter. So you can follow me on Twitter at CanLitHistory or my publisher at PanelXPanel for updates about that, and a link will be in the description below. You can also stick around to the end of the show to know more about that project. If you want to support the show in a different way and help us grow, I also set up a Ko-fi page, which is more of a singular donation-based platform. If you want to chuck in the occasional buck, just to support us. I know that Patreon is the more popular method at this point, but I haven't taken the time to set that up just yet. Anyway, on with the show. I think it's safe for me to start the episode off with certain assumptions about what I covered last episode. I'm referring here to the differences between the Inuit, the First Nations, and the Métis people, for example. Today is a kind of follow-up to that podcast, so if you want to know more about the differences between these indigenous peoples, check out the start of episode 8. For now, let's cover some groundwork about what I mean when I use the term First Nations or Aboriginal. As I mentioned in the prior episode in reference to the Inuit, it is important not to fall into generalizations when talking about the First Nations. In much the same way as you can't claim too many similarities between, for example, all English or French or Spanish speakers in the world. There are differences in cultures and language across Canada that define various nations and peoples within the Aboriginal communities. But there are still certain recurring points that we can start with before branching out into the specificities. Because explaining the differences between all of the nations would take multiple episodes, once I'm done with the main overview, I'm going to focus on the nations and communities that are more prevalent in Eastern Canada. My decision to do this is for time's sake, and because in examining an early impact of writing on oral traditions, it is difficult to find an earlier impact than that had on the Eastern nations, just because they are the ones who had a more direct and consistent interaction with the writing using Europeans who first came to Canada and would change their way of life forever. As time goes on into the later 18th and 19th century, as Europeans moved west, then we can have a bit of a more concrete talk about the other communities. But that will have to come at a later episode. The peoples we know as First Nations, which are the population that, as the name implies, were the first to arrive and establish themselves here in Canada and on the North American continent, are estimated to have come to this land between 12 and 35,000 years ago. If there's some confusion about the population that I'm referring to right now, you might know them through a different name, especially if you're from the United States, where that term is still a bit more prevalent, and that is Indian. It's no longer really used here in Canada, although it was for a long time in official documents and common vernacular, but that term has been sheared away and replaced with First Nations, which is considered more appropriate and less offensive than Indian. Now, the most clear-cut way that we can break down the nations that form these communities, and the one that is especially relevant for today's topic, is by using language. In all, there are about 45 languages spoken by various First Nations members across the country. Unlike the dialectical differences that we spoke of with Inuktitut last week, which don't stop the Inuit from understanding each other, we are talking here of straight-up different languages. Not all Native Americans can understand each other. They are not homogeneous in their communicative abilities. If we zero in on today's region of choice, the language families that are found on the eastern side of Canada, from the Maritimes to Ontario thereabout, we find Algonquin, Iroquoian, and Ojibwa. Algonquin is often separated between the central and eastern types, and which includes languages like Cree, Mi'kmaq, and Naskipi. Whereas on the other hand, in Iroquoian, you will find languages like the Mohawk, Oneida, and Seneca, for example. Within each language family mentioned here, there are dialectical differences mostly brought on by region, and like the Inuit, there is an understanding between nations within that same language family. In order to demonstrate the differences between different nations, even within a relatively small part of Canada, like its eastern section, let's go over some of the major differences of the better-known ones from that region. We can start with the Iroquois League and the Iroquoian language family, who in its own language would have been known, with some variations, as the Haudenosaunee. This language comprised of 5 tribes that included the Mohawk, the Seneca, and the Onondaga, with each of these tribes having a designated role within the league. The Mohawk and Seneca, for one, were known as the guardians of the eastern and western doors, respectively. The Haudenosaunee were more of a sedentary group, as indicated by their name loosely translating to people of the extended house, in reference to the elongated and permanent structures in which multiple families lived in. As York University professor Conrad Heidenreich mentions in a brief description of the Iroquois League, quote, "Like other Iroquoian societies, the maternal extended family was the primary social, political, residential, and economic unit. Individuals were born into their mother's clan and formed a village clan segment with members of the same clan. These combined with related clan segments in other villages and tribes into one of the 10 Iroquois clans. These clans were grouped into moieties, and since members of the same clan and moiety regarded themselves as siblings, individuals had family across most of the league. The clan and moiety system distributed economic risk and engendered social and political cohesion. Decision-making originated within the clan segment and moved upward through the clan structure to village, tribal, and league councils. The clan mothers, senior matrons, were very important, heading the extended families and therefore the clan segments. Their councils appointed and removed civil chiefs who represented the clans and the councils. The women were therefore consulted by the chiefs on all important matters. Through the control women exercised over their families and the civil chiefs, they could declare war and peace." End quote. This is namely what happened, for example, when they went to war with the Hurons, who would actually be completely wiped out or almost wiped out and absorbed by the Iroquois. From here, I might as well segue into the Hurons themselves and their own confederacy, which was also an association of nations, much like the Haudenosaunee, and actually spoke a dialect within the Iroquoian family, but were actually much more independent outside of periods of war, namely when they fought the Iroquois League. Societal differences between the Huron and Iroquois are not major, with the Hurons also centering around a more maternal-based family unit and relationship, and with longhouses also being used at times. The major difference is the relation to government and the celebration of a Feast of the Dead that would not have been seen in other nations. Quoting Heidenreich again, "The individual Huron saw themselves first as members of an extended family and clan, secondly of a village and tribe, and lastly of the confederacy of 5 nations that they were a part of. The most important economic and decision-making level was the extended family, a collective of nuclear families presided over by an elderly matron who lived in her longhouse with her married daughters, their spouses and offspring, and unmarried daughters and sons." End quote. As for the Feast of the Dead, we can read a bit further down in that same segment when it mentions that it is the most solemn religious ceremony of the Huron. During the life of a village, those who died were placed in temporary graves below ground or on scaffolds. Periodically, a village had to be moved to fresh soil and firewood. Just before the move, the graves were open, the bodies removed, the bones cleansed of flesh and packed into individual bundles. When the feast was announced, each family brought their bundles to a large common grave known as an ossuary. Here, the bundles were opened, and men with long poles stirred the bones together, symbolizing union in death as in life. Sometimes several villages from a tribe shared this ceremony. After the feast, the village site was abandoned, leaving it and the surrounding old cornfields to the spirit of the dead. So this is really the major differences that we see between these two groups, the Huron and the Iroquois. But other than that, for the purposes of our show, I think I'll just leave it at those major distinctions. To cap off this section, we can look at a nation like the Mi'kmaq, who lived in and around the modern maritime provinces of Canada and southern Newfoundland, just to show complete and significant differences from the other two nations that I mentioned. This nation, which was not a confederacy or a part of a larger group in and of itself, would have been considered semi-nomadic, establishing villages of around 300 people that would move every so often according to the subsistence abilities that the area would allow for when the Mi'kmaq would hunt, fish, and gather. Sizes of families and villages would have varied according to the seasons, becoming smaller in the winter, down to 10 to 50 people at times, so as to better survive off the more limited resources of that time of year. Given the semi-nomadic nature of this nation, there was little need or desire for a more rigid structure of government outside of the family or village, as with the Iroquois or Huron societies. Furthermore, if you want to take the comparison even further, they wouldn't have these permanent settlements like the longhouses that I mentioned with these previous two nations, because you would need something that didn't take particularly long to build up, and you would just move around with these houses, something that you couldn't necessarily do as easily with massive longhouses. So that just about covers it. How about we take a break and we'll come back with some legends and tales finally. Okay, moving on to a look at stories and legends. Once again, like the Inuit last week, I prefer to give a sense of what these stories were about rather than merely read a story to you. I'll be mentioning some major characters or story names that you can look up yourself if you want to read them in full and go down a never-ending spiral of fascinating myths and tales like I tend to do when I look into this stuff. As would be expected from tightly knit groups who would often find themselves in similar environments or speak a similar language, some recurring patterns and motifs do exist in Aboriginal legends and tales, and they transcend geographical and linguistic barriers. From a supernatural perspective, you'll find stuff like otherworldly journeys, heroic encounters with supernatural powers, or animal wives, husbands, and divinities. You can even get powerful magicians and guardian spirits. Or like the Inuit, you will see a recurring and profound belief in the significance of dreams, in the indwelling spirit of every created thing, whether it's inanimate or not. And finally, you'll see, for example, a belief in the magical power of numbers. The Ojibwa put a significant amount of importance in the number 4, as an example. Metamorphosis and anthropomorphism are essential and significant features. For those who might be unaware, metamorphosis is the transforming of certain things, whether from one state to another, or one object to another, one being to another. And anthropomorphism is the attribution of more human-like characteristics to typically inhuman things. So an anthropomorphic, whale would be a whale that can speak. Even ancient tribal rituals can find their sources or explanations in some of these legends, tales, and plots. The ritual of the shaking tent, or the sun, rain, and ghost dances, even purification ceremonies, initiations, puberty, mortuary rites. All these have their basis in stories that are passed down from generation to generation. They're sung, they're danced about, they're ingrained into the common and cultural memory of these native peoples. Finally, the vision quest, which requires fasting, prayer, deprivation, and, as mentioned just recently, a certain ceremonial purity, also holds quite the prominent place in native legends and tales. Now, I'm aware that that was a lot of information just thrown at you. I wanted to give some quick themes and patterns just so that we can have a groundwork here, but I want to focus in on a specific figure right now. The character that I'm referring to is once again one that is very malleable and that goes through many changes. I'm referring to here the culture hero or trickster transformer figure, who brings about the origins of life as a series of transformations. And he is really the central character in the majority of Canadian Native myths. He can take various forms, whether human or animal, and is known to the different tribes under different names. To the Pacific Coast tribes, he is a raven, and accounts for the existence of all things: the sun, the moon, stars, fire, water, even the alternation of tides. For the Cree and the Saulteaux, he is known as Wisekidjak, and there are many phonetically similar versions of this name. And in their myths, he is responsible for shaping the existing world. To the Micmacs, who call him Glooskap, and the Ojibwas, for whom he is a hare, he made the world specifically ready for man. Or you can find even Nanabozo, who is son of the west wind and great-grandson of the moon, and he gave the Ojibwa the necessities of life. For the Plains people, he's a coyote or old man who existed on Earth before mankind, when humans and animals were not really distinct, and he's credited with putting the world in order. So already you can see what I'm getting at here is this one similar figure that's kind of seen across Native American culture and has a similar role, although it with slightly different details and with a different name. But there's still always this transformation that goes on, and this idea of creation and of reshaping the world in various ways. At times, the hero trickster is presented in antithetical roles, as an actual creator or as a helper who might either cooperate with or thwart the creator. Sometimes he's a beneficent culture hero and helper of mankind, or a malevolent being. Sometimes he's an all-wise, powerful shaman or a credulous fool, a crafty trickster able to change himself into animal and human shapes, or straight up the butt of ridicule, as a joker or a scapegoat who often falls victims to his own and others' wiles. His adventures, whether mischievous or not, always lie in well-known localities within the territory of the band among whom the story is told. The trickster will perform his altruistic services first to satisfy his own ends, and only incidentally for other men. So often he is responsible for the way life is to this nation or to this tribe, but as a byproduct of his tomfoolery or his actions that he doesn't really think about in terms of mankind, but more in his own selfish ways. And because of his great power and his influence over the world, it helped shape the location we're in when we're telling the story. You can also see actually the trickster use a variety of animals to enact his plans or his manipulations. You'll see sometimes a wolverine, a badger, a raccoon, a crow, or even a mink in a few cases. Now, it's interesting because natives approach history as a concept in a similar way as I've been explaining their approach to storytelling. It's very malleable. It's subject to a lot of change. And this is where we can relate it back to the Inuit traditions. For non-natives, these stories can often be a bit disappointing or at least confusing. This is especially true with those preoccupied with exact chronology and factual details concerning a people's history or identity. The constant evocation of a confusing assemblage of mythological figures or traditions or stories, and the frequent introduction of supernatural causes and interventions have created a hodgepodge of details concerning historical origins of a people or where a story came from, or even what a story is. Countless variations of a single tale, even within the same tribe or band, can often seem off-kilter to many of us. The treatment of a story may be altered by the taste, gender, or life circumstances of the narrator, as well as by the place and time of the telling, and even the particular audience. West Coast families have handed down their own versions of stories that often contradict the traditions of their neighbors. There's no interest in reconciling such differences. And I find this particularly interesting. There is no one version of history or storytelling for natives, which is a concept that is relatively modern in Western philosophy or storytelling. Eurocentric populations have tended to think of history as a monolithic structure or a continuity for centuries. And it is in the last decades that thinkers from this tradition have attempted to move away from such ideas, particularly in the field of humanities like literature or history. But for the Aboriginal nations, this conception of history has been accepted as par for the course because it is so influenced by their narrative traditions of just going off on these tangents and of creating these unreliable narrators and these weird characters that seemingly have no purpose other than their own. Their way of interpreting history is much the same. But this is not an absolutely flawless way of going about history, though, and problems could be mentioned from before European intervention. For example, if we turn to the Iroquois once more, a group whose form of government inspired the praise and emulation of the American founding fathers, with their traditions being among the most systematic and coherent of the First Nations, their chronicles nevertheless lack historical data. For example, details concerning Deganawida, the chief who carried out such important constitutional change as the formation of the League of the Iroquois, are often obscure and casual. Peter Jones, the famous Ojibwe writer, noted that the natives' notions as to their origins are little better than a mass of confusion. He has claimed that many traditions were based around dreams, which will account for the numerous absurd stories current amongst them. Now, as one might expect, the influence of European societies still had a certain and more recognizable impact on that perspective of history and stories. I'll give you 3 tries to guess where this is heading. As we've touched upon multiple times in this show, European contact with natives brought along a series of dramatic changes to Indigenous lives in ways that were much more rapid and earlier on than what the Inuit saw. Beyond the typically covered death, displacement, and assimilation, in terms of language and myths, the French settlers and missionaries that came to Canada did not waste much time in writing down and interpreting the native traditions they encountered. One of the first attempts at this transcription, often one that was verbatim with little to no attempt at adapting a literary style, was found in the 17th century text known as the Jesuit Relations. This French text is essentially a collection of letters and reports that were sent from Jesuit missionaries back to the French authorities and government as settlement and exploration was starting to gain traction in North America. There you will find accounts of missionaries, settlers, and Native American lifestyles, descriptions of the land, and obviously the recounting of certain Native folklore. In a rather condescending fashion, many missionaries expressed amazement at the Native people's literary faculties, with Father Paul Le Jeune noting in 1636 that, quote, "Metaphor is largely in use among these peoples. Because Native peoples associate an idea with an object, with visual memory, they invariably make use of metaphors and analogies. And because they pay more attention to the implications or suggested meanings of their words, their metaphors tend to embody an emotion or force more than anything else. It is this power of arousing emotion by making apt comparisons that constitute one of the greatest strengths of their oratory tradition. Orational skill was actually held in the highest esteem among Native populations. This is something that Le Jeune states as one of the reasons that a Native leader was obeyed so faithfully. His power grew in proportion to his eloquent manner, because his followers had no other law than his word. A bit later, in 1645, Father Jérôme Lallemand quotes a speech given by an Iroquois spokesman at Quebec in order to illustrate the orator's style. I'll give you the English translation of this French transcription of the quote of the speech, but it still gives you an idea of the metaphors that I was talking about. Quote, "Onontio, thou hast dispersed the clouds, the air is serene, the sky shows clearly, the sun is bright. I see no more trouble. Peace has made everything calm, my heart is at rest. I go away very happy." End quote. Much like the stories and tales that are integral to Native American culture, sentences are short and straightforward. The language used is clear and simple, and an image of nature dramatizes the speaker's feelings. This combination of traits show how a story, communication, or message needed to be accessible for all, no matter how complex the idea ultimately could be. The point was to get the words across, and in the case of storytelling, allow for some interpretation if possible. Now, such accounts as the Jesuit relations would continue through to the end of the 19th century, at a time when the doomed culture theory, which was the belief that the Native peoples would soon be extinct, prompted a more systematic effort to preserve their oral heritage. You would find here expeditions of anthropologists, including the same one we mentioned last week, a certain Mr. Boas. You will find ethnologists and folklorists, and even much later, sociologists, who went to live and work in specific regions among particular tribes. These trained specialists would continue to transcribe the tales into literal translations, in simple English, with once again, no attempt at a literary style. This was done as an attempt to preserve the integrity of the lore. In many instances, their publications offered the narratives in the original, with an interlinear literal English translation, thus adhering as closely as possible to the forms in which the tales were told. But despite the sometimes noble intentions behind the transcription and preservation of the native oral traditions, issues do arise. Once again, as I opened up to discussion 2 weeks ago with the Inuit, the most evident issue is the solidification and generalization that necessarily arises when disparate and varied spoken stories are written down in a very fixed and stable form. I want to take this idea even further here and add a few more complications to the mix. Because of their many wanderings, and because the history of European Native relations has obscured many original Native values and attitudes, much legendary lore has been debased and distorted by later generations, or has entirely disappeared and been forgotten by the living. This is not only because of the expected changes that are brought by different native interpretations of a same story or changes in circumstances in the lack of a story's relevance, but because of important European interpretations and additions. Elements of European thought and missionary teaching have been so assimilated into an acculturated tradition that it is sometimes difficult to separate the European accretions from authentic native lore. And in an effort to systematize Aboriginal lore, they applied a European system of categories and classifications to them. For example, many Europeans had pet hypotheses that they wanted to prove, so they exaggerated similarities to Scandinavian, Greek, and Hindu mythologies and found Jewish and Christian analogies to the Native American stories where there were none. They also studied resemblances among the tales themselves. So they exaggerated the similarities rather than accepted the differences and go with them. Taking this to a greater extent, according to the Jesuit Relations, the notion of the Great Manitou in its personal sense was introduced by the Jesuits themselves. The concepts of one single God and the devil as the prince of darkness, the distinction between good and evil gods, and the pitting of one against the other, the belief in future punishment or in an abode of evil spirits, all of these concepts were foreign to Algonquin tribes. And this Great Manitou edition kind of shifts that balance around, introducing dichotomies where before it was much more nebulous and featured many more gray areas than simply good and evil, and that's it. In modern times, some tribes, with only a handful of native elders remembering, tend to emphasize what is most recent in their collective memories, relating stories of events that took place since the advent of white settlement. So you see a complete shift in the way these stories are approached, and you see a homogenization of them that didn't exist prior to the 16th or 17th century. Now, countless native tales have been retold and interpreted by non-natives, partly because of the demands of the marketplace. Much reshaping and editing has been effected. So, for example, references to sex, procreation, and excretory matters were expunged or minimized. Difficult allegories and allusions were straight up ignored or simplified. Repetitions, digressions, obscurities were omitted. There were some missing links that were added in order to create a more coherent story. Some loose structures were tightened, and even perceived childishness was concealed. Now, so as we mentioned before, this completely changes the way in which the story is approached, and it changes the culture, and it changes the way in which history is understood and culture is understood by these native folks, for the sake of selling a better book to people who didn't understand that way of storytelling. To be fair, these editorial revisions have often been carried out with every attempt to recreate the spirit of the native originals. But the well-intentioned desire to extract English storytelling elements from them has led to total misrepresentations. Generally speaking, non-native storytellers, unfamiliar with the native mind, have failed to master native material. According to the natives themselves, much of the dramatic power and fun of their mythology and folklore emerge only when their stories are told in performance in the original language. Many tales comprise the dramatic portions of ritual, festival, and ceremony, elements considered more important than plot and characterization. This is something that would have been particularly relevant at times like the Feast of the Dead that I spoke of in relation to the Huron at the start of the episode. This would have been an event not only heavy in social importance, but rife with meaning and depth about life, and that would have been reflected in the stories that were told during this ceremony. A straightforward plot would understandably have been difficult at capturing the full scope of an event like the Feast of the Dead. Now, in print, they lose their dramatic force, but the native linguistic context brings to life the pungent wit and rich vein of comic pleasantry, the metaphorical skill, imagination, and psychological insight that writing just simply doesn't get across. Even humor, which was sometimes considered obscene by non-natives, provides comic relief in a violent world. And that's lost when written down and translated to a completely different medium for a different market, for a different audience even. Indeed, there are scholars today whose knowledge of native languages and traditions has led them to recognize an appropriateness and coherence in Aboriginal myths and folklore that is placed within the context of the native way of life that had not been previously understood. But this is something that is relatively recent, right? And for generations and decades, this wasn't the case. So how can I sum this all up? I think it's been difficult to speak of these native myths without European interference. But when talking about these early days, it is an inevitable byproduct of the way we know so many details about these legends and myths today. Since the 19th century, there have been more and more Aboriginal writers that produce original material, but when speaking of a time before that, it is in terms of transcriptions and the way those have been modified to an increasingly shifting context. For the non-native, transcription of oral myths lack dramatic emphasis and highlights, subtlety, characterization, and plot motivation. They tend to be a potpourri of unrelated and incomplete fragments, often very brief and almost incoherent. Some are merely summaries of reports or events. To people schooled in the English literary tradition, including many native people who understand little of their language of their ancestors, the rambling conversational manner and exaggerated action of native myths can be tedious, and their arcane subject matter and hermetic meanings can be frustrating. So I can understand from their context, despite it being very frustrating and mind-numbing that happened, I can understand why they would want to modify it so as to understand it better. But that removes from the importance of those stories. That removes from the value they had originally. And just because they weren't as coherent as we're used to, that doesn't mean that they were unworthy of study. And for that matter, it doesn't mean that the transcriptions are unworthy of study either. It's just we have to be aware that the context is completely skewered. Personally, I think that the most important takeaway, aside from getting to know some interesting stories, which is always fun, is this more erratic version of history. This multifaceted take on a historical approach is something that fascinates me, as it provides almost a more accurate take on the multiple perspectives that are present in history. Unsurprisingly, this is one of the things that I'm trying to do with this podcast, to provide these multiple points from which to approach history, including literature and culture, and how it's interpreted. There are these variations of the same event, i.e. in this case Canadian history, that can be completely different and can change our understanding of what a people or a history is. It is never as simple as having one vision, and the Indigenous use of varying stories to tell one history reflects that. Finally, this is a perspective that is often overlooked in terms of Canadian history and literature. Lately, it's been getting more pull than in the past, but it is good to see the unheard get a clearer voice through a medium that is received by more people, that is, the written word. Despite the deformation of those tales over the centuries, there is still a valuable resource for understanding a people and their evolution. And if those deformations allow them to reach more people, then it is not necessarily an entirely bad thing, if far from being perfect. Okay, that should just about be it for this week. I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to plug the essay I wrote for Panel by Panel one last time, which you can get your hands on through the Kickstarter link up until the end of March, and that is in the description. After March, you won't be able to order it through Kickstarter, so you better get your hands on that right away if you want it. I'm part of an initial wave of print releases that the publisher is doing, so if you're interested in articles, essays, and criticism about comic books, check out Panel by Panel one-shots, or even the regular digital magazine that's also very interesting. The one I wrote is called Giants in the Shadows and is about how comics interpreted or changed at different moments in Canada's history, which is why I'm plugging it on this show. I talk about single panel comics found in Punch magazine during the Victorian era, all the way to Superman, and into the modern indie comic scene of Montreal. You can also support the show through the Ko-fi page I set up, the link for which is also in the description. I might set up a Patreon page in the future, but for now I want to stay with the more single donation-based system that Ko-fi encourages and move to Patreon if the demand is there and if I can find the time for some valuable incentives. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at CanLitHistory if you want to reach out through me through there to suggest topics or just discuss. If you would also consider leaving a review, even if there are no comments, it would be very much appreciated. It does help, and it's easy to do on iTunes. It takes about 5 seconds, and it helps boost the show. For now, I will say see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.